but the overall thickness and width that is going to catch everyone's attention when you turn around stem from the... Yo, what's the crack? In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing what I consider to have been the 5 most consequential exercises for the growth of my back as a whole. I made a very similar video a while ago discussing my top 5 chest movements, so I guess this is a continuation of a series where I share with all of you what it's been working for me for the past few years. Given individual differences, preferences, and goals, I am of the opinion that the following exercises should not be regarded as mandatory. I think these are solid options you can consider or draw inspiration from, but at the end of the day, it is up to you to figure out your own top 5. And the only way to identify these is through the long and repetitive process of trial and error at the gym. Alright, let's jump right into my top 5 exercises for the back. I'll start off with what I called oomph shrugs. This is a lift whereby you intentionally load scapula elevation to target the upper traps as well as other deep muscles underneath. However, given the sheer amount of total weight you could lift, other muscle groups like the delts and neck are going to be heavily involved. From the front, having protruding upper traps gives you a more overall muscular and intimidating appearance. Looking at it from behind, the trapezius is a large muscle group on a surface level that tends to catch people's eyes when you perform scapular movements. I personally like heavy shrugs performed with a fair bit of body English. This technique emphasizes the loaded stretch of the traps as I'm forced to catch a falling weight. This is a variation of a shrug where I do believe that you should ease your way into it, especially if you've only done strict variations up to this point. If you want to learn more about this topic, please check out this video later on. A final word on shrugs. I stay away from both cables and dumbbells when it comes to shrugging, if only because the former doesn't allow for the throwing and catching of the load. And with regards to dumbbells, once you can do 25 plus reps with a heavy set in your gym, things become impractical and time consuming. For most people, I'd recommend using a straight bar or a trap bar. Either option allows you to make the exercise as heavy as your frame can handle. So, shrug up, bitch. Face pulls are a fantastic tool to put the final touches to a great upper body workout. However, let's not kid ourselves about the importance of this movement. Despite my nickname here on YouTube, I do concede that both face pulls and shrugs aren't really that type of foundational movement to build a great back. Most people wouldn't be able to build a Cobra-Looking, V-taper, and strong back of these 2 exercises only. So that means that from a top-down perspective, movements number 4 and 5 on this list are second tier at best, and they should be used after your meat and potatoes kind of thing, as you're about to see. Face pulls are a fantastic way to introduce shoulder external rotation while you perform a pulling motion. Either with rings, elastic bands, or cables, I enjoy each and every one of these very much. To my mind, the best quality of face pulls is that they are very forgiving to the body. You could literally complete multiple sets of face pulls to failure every day of the week and benefit from it. You couldn't say the same thing about oomph shrugs though. The latter is very costly in terms of fatigue due to the massive tension your muscles and bones endure when working with big weights. Face pulls, on the other hand, can't be overloaded as heavy, so this limitation makes them a good candidate for a high-frequency approach. Face pulls and heavy shrugs are going to give the musculature around your shoulder and scapular complex a more yoked, resistant, and bulletproof shield of meat. But the overall thickness and width that is going to catch everyone's attention when you turn around stem from the old school classics. The more jacked I get, the more I appreciate the time-tested basics. For me personally, rows are key when I program my own back training. The bros got this one right once again with the catchy phrase, "row to grow, bro." However, I do have a couple of issues and concerns when it comes to promoting this horizontal pulling movement pattern to an audience that is likely to be largely made up of novices and beginner lifters. The first one has to do with the potential for messy technique and execution. I cover this topic extensively in this video up here. If you want to go into the nitty-gritty about which mistakes beginners typically make when performing popular row variations with free weights, make sure to catch it at the end of this video. Most people don't understand human anatomy well enough to avoid detrimental muscle overlapping and thus ignore the key premise that not all rows are equally taxing to the body. You shouldn't perform certain row variations with the same level of frequency, volume, and load if you already have movements like RDLs or regular deadlifts in your training routine. Anyone with some skin in the game understands that rows with free weights that require a hip hinge are harder to recover from, technique is more likely to degrade during a set, and the lower back would typically become the limiting factor, not the actual muscles that you like to grow. So, as a general rule of thumb for a large group of the population, I would much rather see people be introduced to rows through a bodyweight exercise like the inverted row, or through a seated version that offers the trainee the possibility to pull a cable or work with a guided machine. Having said all that, the complexity of the rowing mechanics doesn't take away from the fact that this is an absolute moneymaker when it comes to back development. Horizontal pulls done regularly in your training using different intensity ranges and implements are going to be a fantastic option to target your upper and middle back, as well as the lats and the rear delts. Believe me when I say that on my multi-year grind into an intermediate level, I've tried all kinds of rowing variations. But if I have to pick 3 for the rest of my life, I'd choose inverted rows with rings, a seated single arm machine row, and a single arm row with dumbbells. The last one either on a bench or off the floor. Given my personal goals and training style, these 3 variations are the most suitable choices to go along the top 2 exercises on today's list. Speaking of which, let's take a look at number 2. The hip hinge I usually program to bias my back is the block pull, which is essentially a regular deadlift performed with a shorter range of motion. Instead of pulling the weight off the floor, I do so off an elevated surface of roughly 4 to 5 inches. By reducing the displacement of the load at the bottom, I'm essentially lowering the contribution of the muscle groups that are more engaged when there is a higher degree of hip flexion. This way, I take a little bit off the plate of the hamstrings, glutes, and lower back and shift a bit more of the work towards my mid and upper back. Similar to what I said about the oomph shrugs, this is not the kind of exercise you want to program very frequently. Despite how fatiguing and taxing block pulls could be, all things being equal, they are a little bit more forgiving to the body than regular deadlifts. The actual movement still originates mostly at the hip, but the sheer tension caused by the heavy load provides a potent stimulus for the whole back complex. The simple act of holding the load while you extend up the hip is sufficient to cause a degree of muscle hypertrophy. However, I am fully aware that the best possible results for most people will be achieved when you combine block pulls with either rows or the first movement on this list. But before I talk about my number 1 back builder, please let me just briefly acknowledge the honorable mentions that I sometimes perform in the course of a year of training. Some of these could be part of a very respectable top 5 back builder movements given how effective they are, but at the end of the day I'm just sharing the ones that I do more often in my training. So please be aware of this personal bias baked into it. The first one is the dumbbell pullover. I would consider this exercise more of a total upper body exercise rather than a back focus lift, given that the upper chest, long head of the triceps, and serratus anterior heavily assist the lats in displacing the load. Besides, I've only started to program pullovers quite recently, and I feel like I haven't fully experienced its potential gains over a long enough period of time. I'll revisit my thoughts on this lift once I get stronger at it, and I've used it consistently for another year. The second exercise worth mentioning is the lat pull down. Many people make this lift their bread and butter for a vertical pull and thus pick it over the pull-up. However, that's not me. I do see the advantages of the lat pull down though, especially when it comes to implementing high effort techniques like a drop set. In that case, it would make sense to include this exercise. I would personally use it within the context of a more moderate upper body day, or alternatively as a secondary vertical pull for higher reps after having completed weighted pull-ups within 4 to 8 repetitions. However, these instances are rather the exception for me and not the rule. My lats happen to be one of my best body parts, and I haven't felt the need to spam this muscle group with additional exercises other than pull-ups and rows. The third movement I would encourage people to try is the seal row. This variation is, on paper, the strictest horizontal pull you could find, and many lifters swear by it. However, if your gym doesn't have the equipment, setting up your own station could be very tedious. This is actually the reason why I haven't done it for a while, and why it didn't make it into my top row variations. Look, sometimes you have to pick practical over optimal, but if your gym has a high bench, go ahead and build a strong juicy back with seal rows. The fourth one would be any form of a back extension. I haven't trained any variation of this movement in a while because this exercise doesn't align with my current priorities, but I remember using it quite often leading up to my sumo deadlift PR a few years ago. The bottom line is this: if you're looking to push the envelope in big compound lifts like a deadlift or a back squat, make sure to include an exercise that heavily biases the lumbar region. Please tackle any potential weak link in the posterior chain before it's too late. And finally, I could not bring myself to make a video about building a strong back without mentioning the RDL, also known as Romanian deadlift. It was very hard for me not to include this exercise into my top 5 back builder movements. But the truth of the matter is that despite how incredibly good and efficient and effective this exercise is, the Romanian deadlift has a slight bias towards the lower body. If I found myself in a situation where I have to train my entire posterior chain in the most efficient way, then for sure I would definitely hands down pick the Romanian deadlift over the block pull. But this is not what we're talking about here. But because this video talks about the back in particular, I believe a block pull edges the RDL by a small margin. But to be honest, I'd be in full agreement with anyone who decides to pick the RDL as their top hip hinge for a bigger back anyway. And finally, the pull-up, which is much more than just a back exercise. For me personally, it is the exercise that is going to lay down the foundational strength of your upper body for the rest of your life. I'll go as far as to say that the pull-up is the best movement in strength training, period. And I know this is a bold statement, but at least I've been putting my money where my mouth is. Creating videos on how to get people to complete their first pull-up has been one of the highest priorities on my channel for years. My level of conviction in this movement is so high that I always introduce my clients to pull-ups or regressions thereof as soon as this becomes a possibility. I am still to meet a person who wasn't happy that he or she took on the challenge of completing their first pull-up. The sooner you get to complete multiple repetitions of a pull-up in a set, the better your life becomes. And I'm not kidding. For many of you, going from 0 to 10 plus pull-ups in a row is going to be an absolute game changer. You're gonna look better, you're gonna feel better, other people are gonna look at you differently. Hell, even your credit score will go up. Let's focus on the muscles involved during this back-focused exercise. The pull-up works pretty much your entire back to some degree, and your arms are also heavily recruited. Having said all that, we can't ignore the dominance of the latissimus dorsi during this vertical pulling movement. This is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're interested in enhancing your V-taper, because if that's the case, pull-ups are the best place to start. The truth is, however, that there are certain areas of the back that could still benefit from other movements. These areas could be properly addressed over time with the 4 exercises I discussed earlier today. But the pull-up would have to take a cornerstone role at any training approach that leans towards minimalism for busy folks. I believe that most people could get excellent back gains by using the pull-up as the staple movement throughout the year, while the other 3 big ones, the hip hinge, the row, and the shrugs, are rotated along the way. Additionally, given how good the stimulus to fatigue ratio of FacePulls is, you could add number 4 of my list as a non-perishable side dish to the main course, if you will. And the last thing I'm going to say about the pull-up is that there are endless variations for everyone. Different grips and width would emphasize specific areas over others. Learning about all this is kind of cool if you're into fitness, but for the average Joe, I think it would be more useful to ignore all these nuances and just focus on what is best for you as you go along. I personally favor 3 variations most of the time, and each one of them answers one of these questions. What pull-up do I enjoy the most? Well, I'd say regular pull-ups. Strict chest to bar when possible. Which pull-up am I the strongest at? Well, in that case, that'd be the supinated pull-up, also known as chin-ups. And thirdly, Which pull-up does agree best with my body? That would have to be the neutral pull-up, from close grip to slightly wider than shoulder width. Perhaps this sounds too silly or too simple of a criteria to decide which pull-up to choose, but to be honest with you, the majority of people suffer from paralysis by analysis, so most folks should hear the following message: shut up and pull up. If you liked today's video, check out this other one. I think you're gonna like it. Please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to choose all when you click on the bell to get notified every time a new video goes live. Stay fit, stay strong, help me raise an army of Super Saiyans all around the world. Peace. A war in training.